QSO Today, episode 390, Michael and Kerry Burnette, AF7KB and KC7YL. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Tickets are on sale now for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, returning on March 12, 2022. We have a nice lineup of presentations and speakers. Flex Radio is our platinum sponsor, and Elecraft is our gold sponsor. You can get to ticketing by clicking on the Expo banner in this week's show notes page. I'm still looking for volunteers and moderators for the Expo Days proper. If you'd like to be a volunteer or moderator, please use the button under the Expo banner on the show notes page. Michael Burnette, AF7KB, and his wife Kerry Burnette, KC7YL, are both active in amateur radio, a board member and president, respectively, of their local amateur radio club, and the creators of the Fast Track series of amateur radio licensing manuals, originally designed by Michael for Kerry. As a result, they are both on the fast track to amateur radio success. They shared their ham radio story in this QSO Today. AF7KB and KC7YL, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Michael and Kerry?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Michael and Kerry, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Just for the audience to know, we got to know the Burnettes when they were at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo as exhibitors for the Fast Track Amateur Radio series of books. We'll discuss those later in the show. I think maybe we'll start with Michael. Michael actually made promotional videos for the expo in the past. That was very helpful. That's not a skill that I have. Michael, could we start at the beginning of your ham radio story first? When and how did it start for you?
Wow. Oh, way back in the mists of time. So my dad was a radioman in the Navy in World War II. He rode around on submarines and sent Morse code and worked on their code machines, the secret code machines. And so I kind of grew up with that in my space. And I can remember being in our shop and listening to our shortwave radio that we had. And Dad would be working on something on the bench, and somebody would be sending Morse code at about 1 million words a minute. And while he was still working on stuff on the bench and working on his cup of coffee, he would tell me, oh, this guy says such and such and so and so and such and such and such. I mean, he was amazing with Morse code. So I got introduced to that world just as a little kid. Then about, maybe 8 or 9 years old, I found the plans for a foxhole radio in a Superman comic book. And I com shot a toilet paper roll and found a razor blade, one of those old blued kind of rusty razor blades. And I made this radio, which was completely useless. We were 52 miles from the nearest radio station, but Dad took me into town and we parked about a block away from KMAK in Fresno, and wow, signals came through the air, and I actually heard them in my headphones, and I was hooked. I was a goner from that point on.
What was the hometown, Michael?
Fresno. I lived 52 miles outside of Fresno. If you've ever driven down I-5, down the Central Valley, and you got out in the middle of nowhere and you said to yourself, will this never end? I was about 4 miles from there.
Yes, I think some of us who grew up in California somehow felt the Central Valley was that place.
Yes.
It's not the end of the world, but you could see the end of the world from there.
Yeah. So radio was this thing that came through the airwaves, and it was pretty neat.
What was your father doing in the garage when he was working on stuff? What were his projects?
Well, he liked woodworking. This was a man who had not 1 ounce of art in him. nor any capacity for decoration. So everything he made was very utilitarian. I remember building a utility trailer with him, and I learned how to weld as a little guy. Probably not an OSHA-approved activity for I guess I was probably 10 or 11. But I learned how to arc weld doing that. And yeah, that was he just was always kind of fixing stuff and things like that. He was a foreman. We lived next door to a gigantic substation out on the west side of the Central Valley. And he was a foreman at that substation. And so there was always explanations of electricity going on too. And then later we moved into Fresno, and he became a supervisor, and I was still kind of in that electrical world.
Did you pursue electronics from that foxhole radio? Your father, obviously in the electric business, kind of stimulated that interest, but did you carry that interest yourself into your teenage years?
I did, and I went. Mom took me when we were still living out in the country, so I was maybe 11 years old, and drove me in every day 52 miles to Fresno to go to summer school and take an electronics course. And so I took this basic electronics course, and we built a tube super heterodyne receiver in that course. And hooked it up to a power supply. That was, by the way, my first experience with getting knocked on my rear end by electricity. when I was holding the ground wire onto a faucet and reached over to the B+ voltage. And then I sat down very quickly. I don't think that would have been OSHA approved either, come to think of it.
Well, I think those radios were made by a lot of different manufacturers. Those were the 5-tube super heterodyne radios, right? And I don't think they had like a transformer. Wasn't the chassis hot?
Yeah. The chassis was hot, and you had to hook up an external power supply.
Those were the good old days.
Yeah.
Kerry, what about you? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in the Spokane area. We moved out to a farm outside of Spokane when I was about 8 years old. My dad was in the Navy and was a chief of navigation on subs, so we think our fathers probably met. They were both at Pearl Harbor, so it was kind of cool. I was always out in the shop with my dad. My dad liked to putter around, and he always let me work with him.
And what did he putter around on?
Oh, well, being on the farm, he was always like fixing the tractor or, some kind of machinery, and then I would be able to help him and use the vise, which was my favorite thing to crush things with.
It's my understanding from geography that Spokane, Washington is actually on the east side of the mountain range, right? So it kind of goes down.
It's almost in Idaho.
So it's flat. It becomes flat there. It's a big farm area.
Yes. We lived on a great big hill with switchbacks, but we were in the foothills, really.
Obviously, you're no longer on a farm. How did you end up leaving the farm?
Well, when I was a senior in high school, I visited Seattle with some family friends and stayed with them over spring break and fell in love with it. So I was like, I'm going to live here.
It was that much different from Spokane.
It was, yes, it was green and wonderful, and I loved all the flowers and plants and stuff. And Spokane's kind of brown for a long time.
You stayed in Seattle? Did you finish your high school there, or you decided to come back after high school?
I came after high school.
And you went to college in Seattle?
I did. I went to UW, got a geology degree.
And did you do any graduate work in geology, or you just took that as a bachelor's?
That was my bachelor's, and then I got a master's in teaching. So I taught high school math and science.
And did you do anything more with geology after that?
Not really. Well, I worked for a construction testing company before I got my master's degree. So I tested asphalt and concrete and exciting stuff like that.
And did you find teaching more interesting than that?
Much, much more interesting. Yes. I at that point, I already had 3 children, so I was always helping out at their school, and I really enjoyed working with students and knew that's what I wanted to do.
Let's go back to Michael. Michael, what happened during high school? Where did it take you?
Well, I had a best friend who was a ham, Brent Keast, KE6SV. And he had this amazingly elaborate and technical setup, which I talked to him about, a year ago about the setup, and he told me what the radios were. And it was a Heathkit DX40, which has about 4 knobs on the front, and his receiver was an HR10 with the old slide rule dial on it, But man, this looked like the most technological, complicated thing in the world to me. And I was amazed by what he could do with it. He could sit there with his Morse code and talk to places far away, like Bakersfield, even farther. But I knew I could never do such a thing. I did not have that kind of capacity. So that was kind of my real introduction to ham radio. I was not what you would call a stellar student. I kind of sat in the back of the algebra class and went, why do they have letters in it now? I did gravitate to the performing arts and to writing and language arts, things like that. And that's where I went in college for the brief and relatively uneventful time that I spent in college. I was a radio, TV, and drama major. I was real clear. I wanted to go into radio, commercial radio.
So where did you go to college? And I think you went into radio, right?
I did. Yeah, I went to Fresno State College, which had a pretty good little radio and TV department. And I learned the real basics there. Because they had a student station that had one of those carrier wave transmitters that would transmit to the dorms. If somebody remembered to go out and turn on the transmitter, which was in the dorm office. And so I learned how to run a board and queue up records and, all that stuff and talk to a microphone. Now, one day, a friend of mine was the program director of a local commercial station. And he said, hey, you know something about being a DJ, don't you? Yes, I do. Good. I need somebody to work the evening shift. You start tomorrow. That was my audition. So there I went and became a Fresno radio announcer. Fresno, Eric, you have to understand, was an incredible radio market because we had a couple of genius rock and roll program directors fighting it out there, which I know you were down in the LA area. You had KHJ.
Robert W. Morgan.
Yeah, well, Morgan was in Fresno before he was in LA. And so were a lot of the people that you heard on KHJ and the other stations for that matter. And a guy named Bill Drake was the programming brains behind that whole RKO chain. KYNO in Fresno was kind of his laboratory where he would develop things. And then across town, in a station where I would later work, KMAK in Fresno, was this total nut named Ron Jacobs, who invented all kinds of outrageous promotions to compete against KYNO. So I grew up listening back and forth with these radio stations, listening to this amazing stuff going on. So that was going to be my life, was doing that.
Okay, so what happened after that? I'm waiting for the intersection of you and Carrie.
Oh, you'll wait a long time for that one.
It doesn't have to come right away, but I'm interested where this career went, Michael. So you're in the petri dish of radio in Fresno, broadcasting to the huge Central Valley and beyond.
I like to say that my career started slow and then just kind of petered out. But I worked various stations around Fresno, ended up doing, I think about 6 years at KMAK. I was the midday guy, and I also wrote all the commercials and got everything, all that stuff handled. A friend of mine went to work in San Diego. He recruited me to a station down in San Diego that was a country station. And later that became an easy listening station, and I became the program director of that. That was FM 104, K-Joy, easy listening music. See, I can still do it.
Was that KJOY or KJOI?
That was, well, KJOI was in Los Angeles, and ours was KJQY. And if you squint your eyes just right, it looks like K-Joy. And we were only going to say those call letters once an hour because that was the law at that time. And so, you kind of, this is good in San Diego, K-Joy, FM 104. And and then that station got bought by the Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, otherwise known as Group W. And you would know them, Eric, from KFWB in Los Angeles, which was the all-news station there. I got made the national program director of the FM stations. And then I was a vice president and a general manager of a station in Phoenix, KMEO. From there, I went off and bought my own radio stations in Bend, Oregon, which was a complete financial disaster, but a lot of fun. Sold those, had done everything I ever wanted to do in radio, and went into the personal development and personal growth training business and ended up going all around the world with that.
What year was this that you made this transition out of radio?
That would have been about 1985.
And now this message from Icom America. Now is the time to spice up your ham shack with Icom's new ID52A handheld portable radio. Now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF bands this winter season. Did I say that the Icom ID52A is now shipping? Icom's newest handheld radio is a VHF-UHF dual bander with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The Icom ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other ID52A features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It supports VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode. It has an integrated GPS GLONASS receiver, including grid square locations. Other features include micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer and programming and charging, and of course it is IPX7 waterproof in case you drop it. Be sure to check out the new Icom ID52A at your nearest ham radio dealer, along with a full line of amazing Icom radios. And when you make that Icom purchase, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. I have this question. I mean, you being a radio personality, how was it to go from, say, top 40 to country and then to easy listening? Did your show name change? Did your personality have to change? How did that work?
Well, calling me a radio personality is really generous, Eric, but I was never really a very talented announcer. Huge amount of desire, extraordinarily limited talent. So I was the guy who was good enough to be on the air in the middle of the day. But I never would have been the big star morning or afternoon announcer. I could keep the radio station on the air and sound okay, but really needed to have another job at the station to make myself useful. Going from top 40 to country, no change at all. Same delivery, same routine. Learning how to be an easy listening announcer. Fortunately, I had some mentors for that, some consultants who kind of sat me down and taught me how to do that, and we had pretty great success. We had the longest run of #1 rating books in San Diego history with that, and we were #1 in every market that we were in except one. I never could get Dallas off the ground, but Houston, Denver, and a whole bunch of other places. We did really great with that. So I was better on that stuff than I ever was on the air.
So then you become a personal development guru. I think, in the 80s, who would you be following in terms of personal development? This movement was beginning to rise, I think, in the 80s.
Well, it had actually kind of peaked by the time I came along, but the work I did came out of the late 70s, mid 70s probably. It's really not the Brian Tracy motivational speaker type stuff. It's more related to what Werner Erhard and Est did, which is philosophically based and pretty rigorous experiential training. My own background was with a company called LifeSpring, which had at one point centers all over the United States. And I came along just in time for it to pretty much go broke. But the work continued, a lot of it overseas. And so I spent, 20 years commuting back and forth to China and Hong Kong. Loved it. Loved the place, loved the people. I really miss Hong Kong.
This is an interesting story. So you're actually reinventing yourself all along the way. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I've had a few adventures is the way I put it.
And how did you meet Kerry?
We met in the early days of internet dating. We went on, what was the site, hon?
Match.com.
Match.com, that was it. We both had pretty tight geographic restrictions on who we were going to see. I had gotten divorced and, was out single and roaming the planet. I was just going to date people there in Bend, Oregon. Well, Bend, Oregon is not a real big place. And one day it sort of dawned on me, I live on the road anyway. What do I care about a geographic restriction? And so I opened up the geographic restriction, and Kerry showed up because she had done exactly the same thing at about exactly the same time.
That's true.
And that geographic restriction was nationwide or to the west, or for you it didn't matter?
For me, it didn't matter. I'm not sure what hers was, but for me, it was kind of like, I'm all over the country doing this work anyway. So
I kind of opened it pretty wide as well, even though I don't know why I did.
So for the listeners, who the demographic tends to be older, and so we all are going to listen to this episode with amusement. Say a little bit about that. I mean, how does that work exactly, that the two records connect, you start writing back and forth?
That's kind of the essence of it. You make this profile of yourself, then you list what's important to you and a person that you would be dating, or even a life partner, which I really was not thinking in those terms. Then the computer somehow does its magic and says, hey, you might be interested in this person or that person. And I think Kerry showed up on my list. I don't know if I showed up on hers, but eventually we started emailing back and forth.
You showed up on mine.
Okay.
And we emailed, and we were emailing very shortly, like 3 or 4 times a day, and then we exchanged phone numbers, and we were pretty smitten very shortly. And that was in 1998, wasn't it, hon?
That's it, yeah.
I think that this idea of romantic attraction is actually a new thing in human development, that this kind of matching, you happen to do it through a network, but I think up until the 20th century, a lot of people were matched by family members or by matchmakers. This actually seems to me, there's a lot more due diligence in this process than someone who meets somebody at a football game.
I never thought of it as due diligence, but you're really right. Yeah, that's really right.
My twin brother ended up marrying a woman that he had met in school and then carried on a relationship over letters in the time when people wrote letters back and forth. They've been married 41 years, so it does work, it seems.
It sure seemed to in our case, and I can tell you in 1998, if we told people we met on the internet, it was a really weird thing. It was a strange thing to have done.
I'm reframing it from the standpoint, if you put it in its historical context, that in fact romantic marriages is a relatively new thing, in human history.
It is.
In terms of the way that people meet each other.
I think it's about a 19th century invention, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. As soon as men and women were allowed to meet each other without chaperones.
Yeah, that's probably exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so you meet in the late 90s. Did Seattle become the home as a result of that?
It did. Michael, we packed him up and moved him to the Seattle area and...
From Bend, Oregon.
Right.
Which was a breakthrough. Not to slight anybody in Bend, Oregon, of course, but... But comparatively speaking, Michael had seen the light in Seattle.
So not that. I moved to this place, and it promptly rained for, I believe it was 98 days in a row where we were. And I would just sit and look out the window and think, what have I done? I really loved Bend, and I was a skier, and I was a ski patroller and a ski instructor and a mountain biker, and Bend does all of those things. And it was a great little community, but it was missing one key ingredient, which was Carrie. And so off I went to Seattle, and I have come to love this place. But it was not an I saw the light kind of experience, Eric. It was more like over the course of 20 years, the light slowly dawned.
It's a funny thing. Kerry and I were talking before you came on. I was saying that my father says that when he sees sunshine during the winter, a sunny day is when you can see the sun rising between the ground and the cloud layer. But of course, she assured me that actually the clouds break up over Seattle, but maybe they don't over the Olympic Peninsula. It just remains a cloud layer from October until May.
She's an optimist.
So you're together in the late 90s in Seattle. How did the ham radio story then continue? Well,
yeah, more adventures. So in 2008, I had been working for about 10 years in this program at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. That was it was a class that we did called Leadership and Competence for Success program, which I am told is much catchier in Chinese, but that was the name of it. We would have these camps with these folks who were college students, usually in their earlier years, and these are technical kids at this college. So they're going to be optometrists or what we would call physical therapy assistants, or some of them are going to be fashion technologists, which means they know a lot about making patterns for clothing and stuff. Nurses, which would be like licensed practical nurses. So not the cream of the crop in terms of student performance. Those kids, they go to Hong Kong University or University of Hong Kong. These were kind of second tier sort of students, not kind of struggling in school. Honestly, the people skills of a Presto log.
I have to write that down, Presto log. Is that the newspaper that you roll up really tight and that becomes a log on your fire?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. The pressed wood logs that you put on fire.
It was one of those gadgets in the 70s, as I recall. The Presto log was the one made of sawdust.
Yeah. And so the university's vision, of course, was that they would go out and they would become supervisors and leaders and things like that. Well, for that, you kind of need some people skills. So we created this program, ended up being a 7-day camp, and we'd do this pretty high intensity training that was all about communication and leadership and integrity and honesty and all this stuff. And we would give them some people skills over the course of that. And the program was very successful, had tremendous ratings. University loved it. And in 2008, our economy fell apart. And over there, they say when America's economy sneezes, we get the flu. And so they really were devastated by 2008, and our whole program got canceled. And so there I was, thinking that was the program that was going to carry me through to retirement. And instead, I was out of work. I was an old guy, couldn't get hired any place here. Man, I couldn't get hired to unload boxes at Target, much less get some kind of a great job here. So off I went to a place that's always hiring, and that's the trucking industry. And I became a truck driver and did that for 8 years. I did it all over the country for 5 years. And then after 5 years, I went to work for a company called J.B. Hunt that is a big nationwide company, but I had a regional office here where I could just deliver to Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. That meant I could be home on weekends. And that was the big payoff. I mean, I married this woman, and then I promptly went on the road to Hong Kong or China or Austria or Greece or wherever I was doing trainings. And my intention had been to spend my life with her, and instead I was spending my life in chat with her. And then I go off and be a truck driver, and I'm gone 5 weeks and home 5 days. This was not great. So now I could be home on weekends. Well, when I went to work for J.B. Hunt, I had a trainer to teach me their system. And this guy and I spent about a week in a truck while he taught me the whole J.B. Hunt system. This guy's name is Chris Byrd, B-Y-R-D. He is KB7LCR. And you do not know Chris Byrd without hearing about and getting recruited into ham radio. He is an enrollment machine. I mean, if the ARRL had any sense, they would just hire this guy and just pay him to wander around the world and talk to people about ham radio. So he and I got to talking about ham radio, because that's what you do with Chris. And I allow as how I know a little about this. And we start talking about vacuum tubes and antennas and station IDs and all this stuff. And finally he looks at me and goes, "You're an idiot." Well, I had that part down. I'm a truck driver. I know I'm an idiot. He says, "No, you should just go take your test and you could be a ham. You know all the stuff." I do? Well, okay. And so I went and I took the test, and I passed the technician test. They came over and they said, "Well, you passed. Congratulations. Did you want to try for general?" Well, I hadn't studied anything about the general. I kind of looked at the technician book, kind of like, yeah, I know all this. Oh, well, okay, different frequencies, got it. I took the general test, and a guy I still know in our club comes over to me and he hands me the test. He says, "Well, you passed that one. Do you want to try the extra?" I think I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. So I walked out of there with a general class ticket, and Chris Byrd gave me an old Icom radio to stick in my truck, and I would get on the repeaters. And there's a repeater here in the Seattle area that is sort of the trucker repeater. And so at all hours of the day and night, there are a few of us who are on there and chatting away. And that was my introduction to ham radio.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Let's go back a little bit, Michael. As I recall, in the 1970s, studying for the general class license, that there was some radio theory and electronic theory and stuff in there. Did you get some kind of commercial license when you were working in radio stations in order to actually know Ohm's law and some of the basics about radio that's in the general class test?
Well, I held a third-class radio telephone operator's license. I'll pause for applause here. Nothing? Okay.
Well, I have one of those, too. They never asked you Ohm's law on that.
That's like technician light.
No, I understand, but it seems to me that there's a little bit of technical background that you must have in order to be able to pass the general.
Yeah.
Even the technician, but the general even goes into more detail.
It's at this point that we introduce yet another shady character, and that is Rand Leroy Stover, R.L. Stover, or Randy Stover, who was a friend of mine in Fresno, California, when I was in radio there. Now, Randy was one of those guys who's the chief engineer for most, if not all, of the radio stations in town. WA6UOD, Randy Stover. And Randy and I, because I was single and had no life, Randy and I would go out in the middle of the night and fix radio stations. And I did know Ohm's law from electronics class. And Randy was kind of a great natural teacher. And so I'd go, well, why are you doing that? Well, what does this do? What happens if you turn that? Don't do that. Okay. What do these knobs on this big box that looks like a refrigerator do? That was the transmitter. And so I learned an enormous amount from just hanging out with Randy. We ended up building an audio studio that I would use to produce commercials for this character in town who brokered athletic programs on all the smaller stations in town. So, I have fixed a lot of dead radio stations, and they always die in the middle of the night. You know, even when I had the Bend station, I had a lot of nights when I was in there 2 a.m. because it was snowing, and I wasn't going to pay to bring our engineer all the way over the mountain and risk his life because I could grab a screwdriver and fix that thing. So that was my practical background in fixing stuff and knowing electronics.
Okay, good. I'm glad I asked the question. Kerry, so how did you get your ham radio license? It seems to me that, missing Michael on the road might have been a reason why.
You nailed it. Yeah, I was, he was gone 5 weeks, home 5 days, if he was lucky, if he could get home. So when he got his, and then actually he was with JB Hunt when he got it, but still, he was only home on the weekend, and sometimes that didn't work out either because of trucking like it is. He'd get stranded somewhere. I said, I want to get my license. And he said, what license?
That's how unlikely it was, Eric.
So he said, well, you check out this book from the library. It was pretty dry, and I just didn't connect with it. So Michael said he'd make some notes for me. So he did. And I got my technician license. That was in 2014.
From notes that Michael wrote.
Right.
So those notes must have been pretty good.
Well, yeah, they were real good. He then decided to put them on Amazon, thinking he could perhaps eat at Denny's instead of, McDonald's when he was on the road. And so he did that. And then people asked him to write the general book. And then he would still, weren't you still doing that in the truck? Like when you were done for the day? And
I mean, the first 2 books were done on weekends at home and in the truck after I parked it for the night with a laptop.
So these are the fast track books.
That's them.
Oh, that's amazing. So the fast track books started as notes to help Kerry get her first technician class license.
Exactly. And so I was the guinea pig. And so I started proofreading and helping out that way. And then Michael decided to make audio books of them. So then I also started, he taught me how to use the software and piece all of that together and listen for the clicks and all that, you know.
So you became an audio editor of audiobooks?
Yes.
As well as becoming perhaps an editor of the written word as well.
Right.
What a great cottage business story.
Eric, she is ridiculously modest. She is indispensable to the books, to the point where I now credit her as the co-author. She, creating that first book, she would come in and she would go, I don't understand this. What does this have to do with anything? And, oh, okay, well, the context of that is this and that and that and that. And I would add that into the notes. And so, I mean, her proofwriting, her editing, and she listens to me try to explain these arcane concepts and tells me when it's not working and when it is. They wouldn't exist without her.
No, but I think that's so amazing. I'm married to a teacher, and when I try to explain ham radio to Karen, I almost have us both in tears. So you obviously have some knack for being able to create an opportunity for learning.
He is a very good writer. He really is. He's a wonderful teacher.
Over the course of the years, I had filled four-drawer file cabinets with commercials and programs that I had written for the station in Fresno and later the station in San Diego. I had put a lot of words onto paper. And when the whole Bend radio station thing blew up and I blew out of radio, I actually had a time when I was supporting myself with mail order books. I wrote something called, this will be vaguely familiar, The Fast Track to Understanding Radio Ratings. It was a resource for radio salespeople to understand the very complex radio ratings books that come out. Those things they're like a half-inch thick book. They aren't just the rankings that you see in the newspaper. And so I explained all that, and then I would sell them by mail order and made my living doing that for close to a year. So I had some writing background before.
What a great way to make a living. So now I see, if you go on Amazon, every other place that books are sold, your fast track books are available. How did they evolve? I mean, you started with a technician book and then a general class book. I mean, how did this series evolve? And did you change your teaching style over time?
Oh, yeah. The first book was, it was a little 6x9 technician course, the 6 inches by 9 inches, barely illustrated. I knew nothing about making illustrations. I think it had maybe, 4 pictures in it or something. And then it started selling and people started asking for a general book. And honest, what the story Kerry told you is true, Eric. My big ambition for this thing was that I would be able to have a little nicer dinner maybe once a week when I parked the truck. And it just kind of took off. So I kind of took a look at the book and went, gee whiz, people are actually buying this thing. I should probably make this a little more professional. And so at that point, I rewrote the first book and started building illustrations for it. Pretty crude, but at least it was illustrated and had some visual content to it. And the big deal was reordering the questions. So we go through that question bank, which was never designed to teach anybody anything. It's just a warehouse of questions. And we reorder it so that like stays with like, and so that there's a progression to the difficulty of the questions wherever we can build something like that. So I was just working on the new technician book this morning, and like the questions about propagation. Well, if you look in the question bank, they're all over the place. It's like random factoids about propagation. But if you really go through and restack them, it becomes a much more logical progression. And so I start off with line of sight type stuff, and then we go up in the ionosphere, and then we finish up with tropospheric ducting and atmospheric propagation, and step the questions up in difficulty. And I think it makes the whole thing read, I hope, more like a good nonfiction book than just a catalog of questions and answers. And we really go into detail on the context of the question. Why are we learning wavelength? What does it have to do with anything in the world? And how do frequency and wavelength and the environment all interact? And really try and give people a good handle on not just how to pass the test, but how to pass the test and understand the stuff that's in the test, and even go on and be a ham. Because the sad truth is that the majority of people who go in there and take that technician exam and walk out with that CSCA touch clutched tightly in their fist will go home and they will download their new call sign, and that will be the last thing they'll do as a ham radio operator. They'll never touch a radio because it's just too big a leap from I memorized the questions to this exam to, oh, what am I supposed to do? And so all along the way in all of our books, we're teaching practical application as well. So yeah, it's changed a lot over the years, and we've rewritten a lot more times than just as often as the question pool has updated.
Well, did the two of you have an antidote for people who actually do exactly that? They take the technician class license, they go home, they download the call sign, maybe they buy a Baofeng radio thinking they're going to get on the local repeater, and that doesn't work out. Do you have an antidote for that?
They arrive at our booth at the Hamfests. They look, it's funny, we have the same conversation over and over. They look up and down at the books and they go, yeah, I got my technician license, but I've never really done anything with it. Oh, how'd you prepare for your license? Oh, I just memorized the answers to the test. It was easy. Oh, okay. Well, one thing you might do is take this technician book, have a look at it if you want, and you might find something in there that you missed along the way, put a little more meaning to this for you. A lot of them end up buying the technician book and just reading it to fill in the gaps in their knowledge. But sadly, I can't run out there in the world and find the many, many hams who don't show up at our booth and tell us their story and let us remedy it. So I wish I had a fix for that. But
well, and hon, we also have some other titles, like finally getting on the air. And then the propagation book. There's and Michael's currently also writing, once he finishes up with the new technician edition, a book on antennas. But also, I think it's important for people to get connected with their local club.
Yeah.
And meet people in the hobby and find some mentors. And, I think
that's a great idea. I advocate that all the time. How have you done that? Are the two of you active and on the air?
We are. I really enjoy the social aspect of ham radio, and I enjoy the nets. So that's getting together on the air with club members and non-members, are just getting on the repeater at a certain time, and we get together and it's an organized check-in, and then people talk about how their week has been going. So you're not only talking about your equipment and how's my signal, but also checking in and becoming friends really with the community. So I do net control. So I help organize that and get people, talking on the radio. We also sometimes reach out to youth, like with scouting groups and stuff, so they can get their badge. We get young people on the radio and get over that. Well, they don't even know what it's about, so it's fun to introduce that to kids, school age children.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, you're a teacher, Kerry, although I think the last time we spoke, I think you're a substitute teacher now. Is that right?
That's right.
So you don't necessarily have an opportunity to bring ham radio into the classroom? Or maybe as a substitute you do, because maybe the day is changed when you walk into the classroom for the first time. Do you bring ham radio to school?
Sometimes I share it with people. I have talked with students about it. I've actually given our books to students just because they've shown some interest or they wanted to know about it. And because I only work for one district, I see many of the same students over and over again. So I have a relationship with them. But also our club does some volunteer work, and we'll meet with an elementary school, and it'll be like a science, technology, what's the E? Engineering, math, and arts. I guess it's called STEAM now. It used to be STEM. But we sometimes, before the lockdown, we would get together with elementary school students and also their parents. And the whole club would go and we would get them on the radio. We brought our tower, set it up, and got them going on it.
What's the radio club that you belong to?
We belong to the Snohomish County Hams Club.
And it's my understanding that you might actually be in a leadership position there?
That's right. Michael is a board member, and I'm the president of the club.
And how many members does Snohomish County Ham Club have?
How many do we have, hon?
We're at a little over 100.
That's pretty respectable.
It's a good-sized club. We have a huge technical base here. Fluke Meters is based over in Everett, just kind of across the river from us. And, of course, Boeing is a pretty good-sized company with a lot of technical folks. And then all the supporting industries for those two, we have a lot of pretty electronically savvy people around here, and that certainly helps our ham population.
It seems to me that a place like Seattle might have more than one amateur radio club. Are there a number of clubs there?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Mike and Key is in Seattle.
There's the Tacoma Club. They're one of those clubs that has their own station set up and a library of stuff. That is a really, really active club. Up the road from us is the Stanwood Camano group that puts on a nice little swap meet every year. There are clubs over on the peninsula across the Puget Sound from us. There are lots of radio clubs here.
Kerry, what does outreach look like with the Snohomish County Amateur Radio Club to perhaps new hams? How is that accomplished?
Prior to the lockdown, it was by word of mouth, and then people wanting to get their ham radio license. Our club would put on classes.
Monthly testing too.
A monthly test. That's right. And so they would test, and then we would offer them membership in our club. They would get, like, if they tested with us, then they would get a year with the club, and we have a mentorship, like we follow through and we call them and check in with them and help them as much as we can. as well as, of course, our volunteer stuff with scouts and with local elementary schools.
Now, did you find with the lockdown that all of a sudden your repeaters came to life? Did people seek social connections when they were locked down using amateur radio more than they did before?
I think they did for a while, and now it's tapered off a little bit, but we had some repeater problems, and that might be part of that. But they definitely did for a while. And then, of course, the testing came to a halt. So we're trying to get that back on track, because I know there are some clubs that have done it with Zoom and with cameras and stuff, but our club hasn't done that. So we want to get that going again.
What's the current rig at the Burnette house?
The main rig, the one that gets used the most, is a Kenwood, TM710 that's in our truck and is a dual bander. It's actually a radio we won at CPAC one year. Wonderful radio.
Great radio.
Probably not a radio we'd have if we hadn't won it, because I'm not one of those rich and famous ham radio authors that you've probably read about in People magazine. But that's a wonderful radio. And then in the house we have an Icom, what I call a disco era Icom. It's an old 746 that remembers when John Travolta could dance. It works. It's a final radio. We picked that up off of Craigslist, I think. And we keep meaning to install our permanent vertical antenna, but at the moment our HF is still our buddy pole that we set up out on the patio and string the wire out the door. But it works.
Now, are you still driving trucks, Michael? Or when you say in the truck, you're talking about a smaller truck now?
Yeah, that's our Ram truck. No, I don't drive semis anymore. I have not for, I think we're coming up on 5 or 6 years now. There came a day, Eric, after the general book and the general audio program, that we sat down and went, if we just did this full time, I think I could stop driving a truck, which was certainly never my dream. And so that's what we did. And it was tough going for a year or so, but we made it work. And now we have this website that has practice exams that match up with all the chapters in the books. And it's turned into this whole system of how to learn the stuff for the exam. And it's pretty neat.
It sounds really neat. What excites you most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I'll let Kerry hit that first.
Well, I'm excited about the challenge of getting out of lockdown and establishing in person again, and reinvigorating our club is really my focus this year. And figuring out how to do it safely, because we do tend to have a fragile population. So I take that as a very serious responsibility. So I'm constantly looking for ways to invigorate and energize our club. That is taking a lot of my time, but I'm excited about it.
How about you, Michael?
Well, I guess I lean more toward, a couple of areas. One is the people side, and one is the technical side. On the technical side, we just keep inventing this really cool stuff. I heard, of course, about FT8 a few years back when I suddenly got very, very popular. And I have to confess, I was in the, I guess you'd call it the curmudgeon crowd. That's not real radio. And so, but one day to just learn enough about it, to write about it, I set it up on my laptop and put the buddy pole out on the patio. And wow, right away I made a contact. And I look this guy's call sign up and it's a contact from about 3 miles up the road in Marysville, but still it's a contact. And then wow, I just kept playing with it, and I had Germany, and I was trying to get Japan, couldn't quite get Japan in at that point. But then I picked up, it was one of the Caribbean islands, and South America came. I was hooked. I was totally hooked. I sat there and played with the thing for 2 hours nonstop while dinner got cold. And so you just never know what's going to hook you. Now we've got FT4 that's usable for contests and things like that. There are, I think there are parts of ham radio that have huge potential that we haven't even begun to tap. The APRS system is amazing, and we have not begun to touch the potential of what can be done with that. There's a similar program in the marine world with boaters, and it's called AIS. And you should see the stuff they do with that system. And it's the same system. It's the same thing we do with APRS. So that's the technical side. On the people side, I hear over and over that we're doomed, and it's just a bunch of old men, and when we die off, there's not going to be any hams left. And we're out at the ham fest, and we don't see that at all. We see younger people coming into the hobby. They're not 12 years old, but they're 30-year-olds. Listen, you got to have some means to really play in this hobby. And so I wouldn't expect a whole lot of folks younger than 30 to be coming into this market. But there's this whole maker movement that's fascinating. People really fascinated with how they can make things and make these things work. And so I think a lot of those people are coming into ham radio, and more of them are going to be coming into ham radio, and those will be participating hams. So yeah, I think the future looks terrific.
What do you think the greatest challenge that we have as amateur radio operators right now?
I'll get in trouble for this, but hey, I've never been afraid of controversy. It's the Facebook hams, okay? If you go on Facebook, on the ham radio pages, you can get more bad advice from more negative people than you even dreamed could possibly exist in the world. It's just, and a lot of it, okay, it's pretty harmless. I mean, if you have an antenna that doesn't work, well, the world doesn't end. You're not going to have much fun, but but they'll happily give you absolutely horrible advice about lightning grounding, and you can burn up your house with their advice. So I think that's one of our challenges is people handing out advice who don't know what they're talking about. And of course, the license strategy on Facebook is just download the questions and memorize the answers, and we know what happens to those folks.
I think I've said this before. I say this maybe all the time, and that is those of us who've been doing this for a few years take it for granted that putting a PL259 on the end of a piece of coax is really hard for someone who's never done it before.
Yeah.
We take that for granted that, it's something easy for us, but that somebody else could pick that up right away. Or making a dipole, or even a ground plane antenna for 2 meters. If you've never done it before, maybe you can't even conceive of what that should look like.
That's what we fight within ourselves, especially me, all the time with the books, is how do I go back and look at this as a complete beginner? Because I've had a soldering iron in my hand longer than I could walk, I think. I mean, I was soldering stuff forever. And I solder stuff that didn't need soldered just because it was fun to do. And how do I go back and have somebody grasp what is soldering? Why do we solder? How do you even pronounce solder?
Kerry, do you have a take on what you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is from your perspective?
I see that students are not nearly as hands-on as they used to be. I used to do this when I taught full-time in the classroom. I used to do this Rube Goldberg project, where they would build their own machine and they'd have to use different physical laws to make their machine. They were required to use different forms of energy and all of that. It was all about conservation of energy. But, where it's challenging to get them, they don't know how things work. They just know they push the buttons on their phone, So I guess that's something I'd like to see more of, is more opportunities for people to get hands-on experience, because I think that's something that's fun.
Without the parents doing the project.
Exactly. And parents doing projects themselves. Let's face it. We were talking about maybe having a Saturday workshop to install your mobile radio, like everybody get together in a parking lot and let's all work on it together.
That's a great idea. I've done that a lot. I had a mobile radio shop years ago. But that's another thing, that if you're a new ham, or maybe you weren't a CBer, you may not know how to do that very easily, even where to connect the radio.
Yeah, and figure out how to ground everything and not have any alternator interference and all of that. They just putting it into practical use and actually getting your hands on it. When I was studying for my extra, Michael got me a circuit board kind of game thing. And that was so helpful. Just snapping circuits together and stuff. So I'm a great proponent of hands-on. I think it's a fun way to learn.
So he got you snap circuits?
Right.
Yeah, that's cool. I got it for my grandchildren. They go from simple to very complicated.
Yes, they do. I just think would be fun to have more of that available.
Do you have advice for new or returning hams?
I guess the first thing I'd tell them is go, make sure you're part of your local club. Next is everything you learned way back when, whatever it was. I mean, even if you go back to Marconi, it still applies. It's still radio. It's still electromagnetic waves going through the air. Yes, we've come up with some fancy ways of modulating it and fancy ways of using it, but that's details. The basics of what you learned, Ohm's law, reactance, all that good stuff, it still applies. Even if you date back to the vacuum tube era, well, pull out the vacuum tube, stick in transistors, it's the same thing. And so, I'd give them that encouragement, and then, tap the educational resources that are out there. The league is my competitor, but I recommend their stuff all the time. If you can lay hands on any book by Ward Silver, yes, who is the guy who writes their license manuals and wrote their grounding and bonding book. I mean, his stuff is tremendous. Gordo's stuff is great, and he's become a great friend of ours and a great booster of ours too. I mean, go multiple sources and learn all you can, because whether you've been in the hobby constantly for the last 50 years or you're coming back after a long break, the whole fun of the hobby is learning.
Right. I think that's true. I think that when I was in engineering school, that didn't end well, but when I was in engineering school, I found that different authors could present the subject differently. And I think that you've created a niche in terms of being able to explain ham radio to someone who's going to get licensed. But sometimes people actually need to hear a different point of view in order to really get it. So I think that's what you're saying, that tap educational resources from multiple sources.
Yeah, it was funny. Gordon West and I were standing in the hall at Pacificon one time. And first off, people think that we're like these brutal competitors. We're not. We're friends. We see each other as being on the same team. But somebody came up and just, got their nerve up and said, okay, I'm going to ask you to, which book should I buy? And simultaneously, Gordon and I said, both of them. Because we both have that viewpoint of learn all you can. And Gordon will say something in some way or give you some way of remembering something that I didn't say. And so will Ward, and so will I. And I mean, there's why limit your learning? Learn all you can.
Kerry, what about you? Do you have some advice to newer returning hams from your perspective?
I agree with Michael in terms of getting together with a local club and getting on those nets and getting on the air again will definitely make sure the license is in place first. But, make sure your license is up to date. And if it isn't, get that done first and find out what's required to do that. But get into the social aspect of it as well. Like our club, we meet for breakfast once a month, and there's just all sorts of activities that you can do. Make friends in the hobby.
Yeah, I guess the bottom line from both of us for the returning ham is get active. Get on the air, get social, and just mainly get active. Don't sit back wondering, how am I going to do this without making a mistake? Go make the mistakes.
It's called amateur radio.
It is. That's right.
That's the great thing about the hobby, right? That we have a license to learn and we can make mistakes and nobody's hurt by them.
That's right. And that's a good point. I also love the fact that it's a relatively clean cut hobby. You don't have people swearing and, it's self-regulating. And I kind of like that. And it just seems like people are just nice to each other. There's a real effort by hams to be gracious of other hams. So I think people need to understand that if they're nervous about it, there's a way you can approach it as, it's okay to make mistakes and people are here to help.
I want to thank you both for coming on the QSO Today podcast. This was a lot of fun for me, and I hope it was for you. So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Eric. It was fun.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Michael and Kerry. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AF7KB or KC7YL in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo menu item in the show notes page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.